Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us on the Capitalist Cast. Today, I am joined by Representative Don Keefer. We try and get started around 10 o'clock, but sometimes the legislative schedule doesn't quite allow for that. So thank you very much for your patience. And Representative Keefer, thanks very much for making some time today to come on and join us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Could you just explain to people what district you're in, whereabouts in the state you're at?
Oh, sure. I am, for the most part, my district covers the top of York County, so South Central Pennsylvania. I have the entire top tier of the county, and then I have one small piece of Cumberland County, so over towards Williams Grove, Speedway, Allenbury. I have that area as well.
Okay. So we asked you to come on today, and this isn't a topic that gets a lot of attention because it seems fairly boring and unimportant. But in the time that I've been watching the budgets and everything like that, one of the things that really gets overlooked to taxpayers' detriments are what's known as special funds. Can you explain what a special fund is and why they're important?
Sure. So special funds are funds in the Commonwealth that sit outside of our general fund budget. So when you hear people make the claims, or the governor, whoever it may be, will say this year's budget is $34.1 billion. That's just the general fund. In addition to that, we have approximately 150 special funds that sit outside of the budget that spend over 40 billion additional dollars. And so when you're really looking at Pennsylvania's budget, full budget of what we spend, we're between 75 and 80 billion dollars annually. But understand the legislature does not vote on how those dollars in special funds are spent. After the initial authorizing legislation to create that special fund, it dictates the terms of where the funds are coming from, and how they have to be spent or what they can be spent upon. That's it. There is no, in my opinion, a good legislative oversight.
So essentially, once a special fund is launched, it basically goes on autopilot. And you had said that's $40 billion.
Yep. Yes, that is. Now, so some of them make sense. Okay. One of them being the pension fund, right? Pension fund. You wouldn't want your pension fund sitting inside of your general fund budget. Okay. So the pension fund sits separately. That makes sense. We have our transportation fund sits separately. So some of them make sense that they wouldn't be wrapped in, but what is happening time and time again, every legislative session, I bet you there's 30 to 40 bills trying to create a new special fund, because once you create that special fund, you don't have to go back to the General Assembly and beg for those dollars. They're automatically appropriated every single year, and they continue to accumulate. Furthermore, special fund dollars don't lapse. And so what I mean by that for the listeners is that at the end of the budget cycle, if you don't spend your money, there's a process for you to spend it. And if you don't, it comes back to the general fund. In the special funds, that does not happen. Those dollars continue to accumulate so high that the treasurer will actually, from time to time, take money out of those special funds and put them into what I consider a savings account, because the surplus is so high. That way he can yield a higher return on those dollars.
Yeah, and this is not this is a bipartisan problem.
Oh, absolutely.
These special funds have been accumulating for decades.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my pet peeves is we have a $250 million annual racehorse development fund. So we see a lot of these special funds are really anything from like special project kind of slush funds to different varieties of corporate welfare.
Right. And I call it's fiscal evasion. So when we went through this, I've been working with a lot of different groups and legislators trying to figure out, like, how do we wrap our arms around this and rein this back in, right? At some point in time, you got to put it back in the general fund so that at minimum, I'm not even saying you cancel the programs. Like, let's just move it back to the general fund. The legislators have to put up a vote, yes or no, to continue spending those dollars. So the fiscal evasion takes place where we put it offline. I would venture to say the first time when I was going through all these funds and I was sitting with a group of about 30 legislators trying to figure out like where everything was, there's a 998 account for each of these special funds. And then I saw to the side, I said, there's a 999 account. I said, what is that? I said, is that, parsed out as part of the 998? And no, it is not. That's what you would consider a savings account. You would add the two together to see what the totality was. And I looked at a couple of members who had been in the General Assembly for quite some time. It's my first time in session. And they were shocked. They did not even know that it operated like that. And I would venture to guess that, at least 50% of the General Assembly does not understand that that's really how this operates. And then on top of it, so you have one, so I'll give to the oil and gas fund, we'll take money. Growing fund, get a certain amount of money. And the greener fund can only spend on certain things. So what they will do is they will give it to another fund that they're allowed to give the money to. And then that fund will give it to where they really want it to go. So this end run around.
So it's becoming a Ponzi scheme. Well, I mean, Ponzi scheme is not exactly the right word for it, but I mean, you're
like
essentially
laundering.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
You're under the laws, you can only spend it on this, and you're like, darn it, I want to really spend it on that, right? So I take it, I give it to another fund, and then that fund can transfer to the fund that I want it to really be into.
Yeah. So I mean, that's quite frankly appalling. And that's one of the reasons why I know last year there was a special fund that was created that had to do with water pollution and that kind of stuff. And what's amazing is that we have multiple funds dealing with ostensibly the same problem, just under different titles. I think when I was looking at it, we have something like 30 different funds that can deal with water pollution or pollution in general. Yeah.
Yes, I say that all the time with environment. I've got a fund for that. Like, what do you need? There are so many water funds. It's not even funny. Environmental funds. There are so many. You wouldn't even believe it. There's the Keystone Parks and Rec Fund is a really interesting one that sits on often over half $500,000 in surplus dollars. And that money comes from, that's the other thing. So these special funds, the Keystone Parks and Rec gets a percentage of your realty transfer tax. Goes into the Keystone Parks and Rec Fund. So when real estate sales go up, they automatically get more money into that fund. So they don't have to come back and ask you for any more money, and they just continue to get to spend the money on pet projects.
And at the end of the day, it's taxpayers who are really, I mean, we're the ones putting up the money for this, either directly or, because money has to be raised elsewhere in order to compensate for the funds that are being funneled and siphoned off.
And so let me get to your horse race development fund you spoke about. Bankers Fund are two of them, but those are paid for. So the horse race development fund is paid through by the different purses. So money that's put in by the breeders and by the facilities that are hosting the racing. Okay. So it's all put in through that industry, and then it's paid out from that pool fund. So they'll say, those are our dollars, right? We are the ones that put money into that account. Well, then maybe we shouldn't be putting, if there's so much there, right? Maybe we should be reevaluating how much we're putting into that account. But it works a little bit different. Racehorse development's a little bit different than, say, the banking fund. Banking fund's paid by banks are assessed a fee. And then they have to, and that's just in case, a bank would, essentially go bankrupt, for lack of a better word. And so if that bank is no longer a viable bank, right, we pick up the tab on that. But they're sitting on surplus dollars. So when we went to sweep all those accounts with surplus dollars, the bankers came and said, hey, listen, we pay that through assessments. And if there isn't a certain amount of money that's in there, they'll come back and they'll reevaluate our assessments and raise them. I said, then what we need to do, though, why don't you come to us and lobby us instead for, hey, I want to be reevaluated to lower those assessments. If they're able to accumulate these kind of dollars that are in there, then they should be reevaluating and reassessing that.
Yeah, and there's really just an enormous cost to try and maintain these these funds, in terms of personnel, in terms of time management, and then, as you're saying, in terms of, these industries, I mean, basically being extorted by the regulators to make sure that there are pots of, just money
Money.
laying around.
So here's another kicker too. So Pennsylvania has a cash flow issue year over year. We don't have it. We run out of money. And it's a timing issue really of when different taxes come in or different revenue streams come in versus when bills are due. But we borrow from ourselves. So we will borrow from the special funds. We pay interest to these special funds when we pay it back. It's crazy. It's our own money. So, I mean, again, if you would streamline this, put it back into the general fund, you would not have that borrowing and cash flow issue. You would really address it. So I do have a bill. I had it last year as part of a fiscal reform package. I have it again this year. And the bill would essentially say that you cannot create any new special fund except for, we would keep the motor licensing fund, the unemployment compensation fund, workers' compensation fund, our state pension system, the ABLE account, the TAP accounts, and any fund into a specific industry for that specific industry. Like I said, for the bankers, or there's another one for it's tanks, like holding tanks, and it's basically an insurance fund should something blow up. So things that are like that are specifically paid into through those funds, those would be permissible. Beyond that, no. We got to be, we got to get this our house back in order.
Yeah. So I noticed, as you said, that you had introduced some legislation on this, and there was a couple other bills that were introduced as kind of as a package together. Do you have enough information about the other two bills that were in there to talk about them, or? I mean, if not, that's fine. We can just I
didn't print it all off. I know the other one. I know Tim O'Neill's is in one of them, and his says, that you have to that any surplus dollars have to go into the rainy day fund. Wouldn't be able to figure out like, oh, well, we're going to put 10% of surplus dollars in there. It would require all surplus dollars to go into the rainy fund. That was one of them. And then the other one, I believe, was Seth Groves, and I forget specifically what that one was off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I think that, when I was looking over and reading them last week, they seemed like reasonable ideas, gosh, it's like a lot of things that in government where it starts out, it's not a bad idea on its face, but what it turns into is just this monstrosity where you have so many special funds, so many kind of set asides. As you mentioned, we're at a point where our general fund budget, kind of the headline number that people see, the 34 or 35 billion dollars, is actually, I mean, it's dwarfed by the accounts that we have in these special funds where it's $40 billion, and it's insane.
And even so, the one time when there's a 911 fund, okay, they're always sitting on a lot of money in that fund as I look over it year to year, and in my county, we've had a lot of issues with our 911 centers. So I'm thinking, why aren't these dollars getting out to what they were intended to go out for? So again, it's that whole bottleneck that gets in there. But what was said when I attempted to touch those, or when they attempted to set up another special fund for 911, was that, well, we have to do it. In order to get the federal dollars, we have to have this special fund to do it. I found that really hard to believe, because I can't believe that all these other states have special funds specifically set up like that. And that is not the case, quite frankly. And then furthermore, as I looked at it, I said, only $5,000 of these dollars that they were initially talking about coming from federal, or $5 million was coming from the federal government, compared to the $50 million tab. And I said, so we have to create a special fund for, to make sure we get that $5 million. So there's a lot of, again, I used to call it shenanigans, but my dear colleague Paul Schemmel has it better. It is chicanery. That's really what it is. It's keeping it complex and convoluted enough that you walk away because you just can't wrap your mind around it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It's like a lot of things that we see where government is made complicated in an effort to make sure that people just can't understand what it's doing.
Absolutely. With everything I try to do, when I just try to get the simple answers for it, well, it's really a lot more complex than that. It doesn't need to be, but it is.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, there's a certain level of incumbency protection that goes along with that. You know, you essentially, the legislature has created a government that's so complex that everybody needs them in order to navigate the system.
Absolutely. And that's the other, so as people talk about term limits and that type of thing, I believe you have term limits every 2 years or every 4 years, whatever your legislator is that's up. But understand those individuals, those either staffers or bureaucratic, entities, right? They are already the continuity that's there to a convoluted system. And if you turn over your General Assembly that quickly, they will become entrenched. And that will be the only continuity you have. So unless you include them in some type of
Yeah.
time limit as well, that you will build this beast. You will actually be feeding the beast.
Yeah, it's the whole system. I mean, just the size of it creates kind of this. It becomes a monster in and of itself. A philosopher, Western philosopher, called it the Leviathan. And that's really, I mean, what it is. It's just such a giant, unwieldy, monstrosity that it takes a professional bureaucracy in order to keep track of it. And at the same time, that professional bureaucracy really just kind of feeds on the complexity to make itself even bigger.
And I'll tell you, as a member, it's easy to get sucked into that, right? And I'll catch myself when I hear myself talking to constituents, and I hear myself using the same language to explain it. And then in my mind, I'm going, I know this person doesn't understand what I'm saying. Makes me backtrack and say, this is idiotic. It should not be this difficult. And, trying to take it back from the constituent perspective of, no, I want to know why I'm paying the tax, what the tax is for, why you want more money than what you did with the other money. That's it. That's all the more difficult it needs to be. And people need to be held accountable for it.
Yeah, if it requires a 45-page PowerPoint presentation, there's really a problem.
Absolutely. So, I mean, and I think you got to have that pushback all the time. That's why I'm always asking questions. And I will say, because of the Leviathan, like you said, this really is so frustrating. So I have hit my head against the wall saying, okay, I'm done. Like, I just feel like you can't even overcome it. So I pull back, I narrow my focus and say, if I could just get this little part done, if I could just get this one thing done. So the one thing I do is I am a vigilante for special funds. When I see a special fund on a bill, I will amend that bill every way to Tuesday to kill it. Just to stop any new special fund. So that's my one little angle that I have. And then this one, I just think if we could get something in place where we say, hey, that's it. It's a moratorium. No more special funds.
Yeah, and I think that it's perfectly reasonable, and I'm sure we'll hear tons of objections to, the common response is, oh, you just don't understand.
Yes.
And that's kind of the common refrain. So
it'll be like, because if we don't do it now, then we'll never do it. And this just makes sure we're taking care of all these little areas. But I'll tell you, there was one that we did, some kind of an achievement fund, and it was just created maybe 2 years ago. And it was a fund that was set up to pay for a special program for delinquent children to go through this kind of a military training academy type thing. Sounds good, right? Let's help those individuals. But again, it was set up through a special fund. We have a ton of different youth advocacy programs, all different types of things, right? But this was a pet project. Now there's a special fund. And now I already see that a Republican member is already trying to increase the amount of money that we put into that fund so that we can train more youth. And then it'll be spun in the fact, well, do you not want to help our poor indigent youth that are, have fallen on bad times?
Yeah. It's just, it's really appalling just how complex, this system has become, and just how many, just how many tricks there are in order to separate people from their tax dollars. And
your lobbyists know the gig. They know the gig. They're the ones usually up here saying, oh, well, this is how you do it. We could just set it up this way. That way we don't have to go to the General Assembly. That way we don't have to ask for any money. That way we don't have to ever ask for increase. We build an automatic elevator on these things, and it's all good.
Yeah, and what we've seen, is the problem, the result of this, we don't have to go to the General Assembly is, as you said, an issue where we have all of these special funds multiplying, but also when we take a look at what that means is it has really diminished the role of the General Assembly in the whole process. And it's not just in this, we see the General Assembly has ceded its authority to the executive branch, to the Treasury, to a whole bunch of different places, and we see the result of that now, particularly as it relates to the COVID situation, where the General Assembly is, well, we can't do anything. Well, that's because for 50 years you've really given away your ability to control the situation.
Absolutely. And that's one of my huge pet peeves. We write really vague, broad laws, and then we punt to the executive and say, there you go, you guys write the details. And then that way, it gives us the ability when somebody comes back and says, hey, this fee is ridiculous, or hey, this new rule is terrible. We can say, oh, it is terrible. That's a horrible fee. And that bad, whatever it is, Environmental Protection Agency, how dare they do that? Well, we gave them the power to do that, right? We do that all the time. It's one of my things, I'm often called out for not asking helpful questions, but I challenge that kind of thing. I say, no, let's put it in writing. Like, we got to be very specific and detailed in the legislation, because we know what the Supreme Court will do, right? They'll write it however they want. If we give them an inch, they will take a mile. And so we absolutely have played a role of why we're where we're at today.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And you bringing up the Supreme Court is also, that's a whole other kettle of fish. But that kind of brings up an interesting, and this is going to deviate from the special funds topic and everything, but we get a ton of questions about voter integrity stuff and, what's the General Assembly doing? We have a little bit of time left. I'd really just like to just kind of talk about that, as quickly as we can,
Sure.
what's going on in that review process and everything.
So I am on state government committee, and what we have done is we have gone through we have a full set of hearings that we're going to do, that we are in the midst of, actually. I had a hearing right before this, or meeting right before this, preparing for a hearing. So we've broken it down into different sections, and then we're bringing in different experts and or people from the agency, asking them questions, getting to the bottom of how things are done, pulling the rules, the guidance, the laws, and what was actually done versus what's actually on the books, and getting to the bottom of that so that we can create essentially an omnibus bill that addresses the different areas that we need to address, whether it's clarifying something, whether it's putting, another law in place. I don't think you're going to get the genie back in the bottle as far as the mail-in ballots, but there's a lot of guidance on there that quite frankly, the Secretary of State just ran roughshod over the law that was in place. So it wasn't just Act 77 that was the issue. There were other parts of standing law that was there that she just completely ignored. She wrote guidance, what we found, in contradiction to the law.
What the law actually said.
Yeah, so she did not follow the law that was there. I was very disappointed that the U.S. Supreme Court did not take up the case regarding the additional 3 days, because that was absolutely rewriting the law, giving an additional 3 days of voting. So we are digging through, we're pulling up all of that to create a package. It's going to have to be some kind of a negotiation, because, as you know, we have a Democrat governor who, he was spearheading a lot of this. And so it's going to be tough going back and forth to see what we can get out of it. But we've got to have some kind of reform and get more accountability and guidance in there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has really frustrated people is, and I know that you and there are other investigations going on into the election process and what reforms need to be taken care of, but a lot of it right now is just stuff that's behind the scenes. So I know that with individuals I've spoken to, there's a lot of frustration that they just don't see anything happening.
Well, and I get their frustration, because it looks like we're not doing anything. And understand, from a legislative front, right, there's only certain things that we can do legislatively.
Right.
A lot of stuff would have to be done legally. But even legally, understand all the lawsuits that we had. I think there was one where they actually entertained any part of evidence at all. So all of the other lawsuits that were brought about were dismissed on technicalities. So whether it was timing or standing or whatever the case may be, they were all dismissed. What I don't really understand, and we're trying to get to the bottom of, from a legal perspective, and I'm not an attorney, is that the reason we had the governor decertified all the election equipment and we got new election equipment was because there had to be a paper trail so that it could be audited. Now, we did do a whole hearing about the audits and found they're really just a farce, quite frankly, of what they do. But looking at the auditing process was so we could go back and look at those paper ballots. So far, I think every request to review those paper ballots, every legal request has been denied by the court. So I didn't understand that, that they even had the ability to deny the review of those ballots. So again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm trying to wrap my head around the whole legal part of it. I think there are more lawsuits that will be pending. And we're going to do some subcommittees as well, because there are a couple members of us that would like to go to a couple select counties and walk through the actual process that's there. But all these hearings that we're having, they are all posted publicly. Like, we live stream those hearings so people can watch those.
Yeah, and I mean that's a good point. And we want to make sure that the problems are fixed, but at the same time, taking the initiative and actually looking at in a really detailed fashion about what the problems actually are. And as you said, some of the stuff it's not going to be able to fix. Going to be able to be fixed legislatively. Some of it is, legal interpretation that's down to the courts.
Right. So we have to get smarter on how we challenge that, though.
Right. Oh, I agree completely. I think the one thing that folks, and you had mentioned the mail-in ballots, and I can understand the desire to want to do, we need to do everything all at once. Let's get it all done. But I mean, isn't there a risk in approaching it that way? I mean, when we take a look at, so we have obviously the primaries coming up in May. One of the big complaints is the lack of oversight at these ballot drop boxes and things of that nature. I mean, wouldn't it make sense to pull out some of those smaller items and say, this is something that we can address immediately versus some of these really big and complicated issues?
Well, so far, the indication that we have gotten from the governor's office is that he would not support it. And the Democrats have demonstrated to us in the past efforts, right, they'll stick with him regardless of what happens. So trying to get a 2/3 override on something like that would be next to impossible. And they were the ones, understand, Buchbar took that whole, those drop boxes. She's the one that took that, used King's Bench power to take that to the Supreme Court and get state Supreme Court and get a ruling for that. There is nowhere in our language that allows for drop boxes. But what the court said was they viewed those as satellite offices.
Right.
Despite that they're not manned, they don't have staff, they're not, no security, but that's how they interpreted it.
Yeah. Well, I guess what my question is more so, can we look at something like the drop boxes? I mean, the governor's not going to get rid of them,
Right. But that's going to be part of our package for sure. Okay. Absolutely. We have to wrap our arms around that because, again, you get into the whole ballot harvesting issue. We also got to get some of those timelines. You cannot allow people to do a ballot up to 7 days before. The counties just don't have the manpower or the capacity to do that. The mail-in ballots, get them mailed out and get them back in time. So that has to be back out to the 15-day mark. As far as as well as your registration, voter registration, they had moved that date around. So we need to put that back to where it was. We got to get a lot of this in place like that, like what you're talking about. Those are things we should be able to get done. And it's messaging in the public, and the public pressure must stay on.
Yeah. I absolutely, and it's important. This is, the ability to have confidence in the elections is really. I mean, it's the function of government. Like if you want the people to have confidence in what happens, I mean, it all starts with a confidence in the electoral process. And there were things that happened, over the course of the last election that really made people question the process as it stands. So the legislature's working on it. I know.
Continue to get calls, and it is critical because if people don't trust the process, right? I've had many people say, I'm not coming out to vote. Understand, the other side wins when you do that. But I need to, as an elected official, I mean, like you said, this is our one of government's number one functions, right? It's to hold a safe and secure election. And so we have to get this done.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on today. I appreciate everybody for tuning in and for their patience. I know that your schedule is hectic. There's just so much going on between the election and all the other hearings and budget season. So I know your time is very valuable. So I appreciate you taking some time out of your day today.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in today, and we will talk to you next week.